Both COVID-19 and Brexit have come at a difficult time for the armed forces and the British economy. As the armed forces have been under transformation for the past couple of years, how will the current crisis affect them? Tactics today is talking with Professor Simon Anglim. Professor Anglim, good day to you.
Hello, Eleni.
Hi, thank you for taking the time. So, will the current crisis accelerate or disrupt this transformation that the armed forces have been under, especially given the projected economic and renewed pressure for fiscal consolidation, do you think?
Well, I hate to say this, but the British armed forces have actually been under steady transformation for pretty much the last 30 years, to be honest. And the current crisis is just the latest thing to come along, and it might not even be the most influential, because a lot of this so-called transformation has actually been a euphemism for cutting costs. The real milestones over the last 30 years have been a series of so-called strategic defence reviews, which have really been reviews of defence spending. And indeed, we had one due in the UK just as the COVID crisis came along, and it seems to be suspended indefinitely right now. I suspect COVID will have an impact on that. I'll explain how in a second. Now, the fact that this has been suspended might actually lead to the armed forces heaving a temporary sigh of relief, because previous reviews have actually resulted in some pretty savage cuts in defence spending and the reduction or loss of some capabilities, and certainly some major cuts in manpower. To give you an example, when the wall came down in 1989, the British Army had 150,000 people in it. Now it aspires to a strength of 82,000, just over half that number, for the end of this year, at a time when it seemed to be struggling with recruitment and retention. Although I must say now, I heard some reports yesterday to the effect that a lot more people are now intending to stay in the British Armed Forces, because they're seen as relatively more secure employers, given certain projections that are being made about the British economy. So that's, if you like, if there can be any positive impact on that, then that's one of them. Now, some of these strategic defence reviews have apparently been driven by austerity. The most obvious of these was the 2010 review, which had to deal with a 38 billion pound overspend by the British MOD, and that led to 17,000 service people being made redundant, a number of Royal Navy warships, including the flagship, the carrier Ark Royal, being decommissioned, and 40% of the Army's tank force being cut. So if we see a recession on the scale that some people are predicting, this postponed review might, and I do stress might, bring further big cuts. But that depends in turn on whether the current government decides to claw back the debts that it's built up in order to deal with this problem with more austerity. And I suspect that that's not going to be politically feasible anytime soon. And I also predict that certain trends in the way in which the armed forces are actually used are going to continue relatively seamlessly. One part of the British Armed Forces that seems absolutely invulnerable to defence cuts is our special forces. Our special forces have actually expanded over the last 15 years as conventional forces have been cut. And there is a detectable trend, certainly over the last decade, of the UK exerting armed forces more and more by using so-called remote means. In other words, having small teams of special forces deployed on the ground alongside local friendly or proxy forces with American and NATO air power, including drones, supporting from the air and actually being guided onto targets by these special forces. Now, we saw this in Libya in 2011. We saw this more recently in Iraq and Syria. And because it involves deploying small numbers of very highly trained volunteer people and very high-tech platforms, rather than putting large numbers of boots on the ground for long periods. That actually makes it, in most cases, a cheaper option politically as well as financially. But there's an issue that's perhaps not entirely relevant to what we're talking about here, in that sometimes this method may be employed in situations where it's not strategically appropriate, where other forms of force or deployment may be better. But I think that's for another discussion. Now, I think what may be a major disruptive factor would be the intersection of the global impact of the virus, particularly its political and economic impact, with the emergence of new international peer competitors challenging the current international order. Russia has already flexed its muscles in the North Sea, and some of its aircraft actually probed the borders of NATO's Balkan member states just yesterday, for example. So a possible issue, I think, might be how the economic fallout from COVID impacts on the need for Western armed forces to get back into the conventional warfare game. So how that works out is probably a little bit too early to tell. I generally try to avoid making predictions on the grounds that I'm usually wrong.
Right, but do you think that there are a couple of likely scenarios based on that?
Yeah, possibly Russia may make a move on another part of Eastern Europe, in the Balkans or the Baltic states, for instance. It probably won't involve overt deployment of military force. They'll be using what a lot of people call hybrid methods, not a term that I like particularly because it tends to be a bit overused. Things like subversion, cyber attacks, propaganda, use of local plausibly deniable proxies. And now seems to would be the right time, for want of a better term, the most expeditious time for doing that, given that the West, broadly defined, is just so absorbed. It's just so consumed by this current crisis. That could be one. Another could be China making moves on certain of its geopolitical objectives in the South Pacific as well. So yeah, this could be a window of opportunity for those who wish to rearrange the current international order, or even just adjust it slightly.
Right. So on to my next question. COVID-19 is often likened to war in the media, particularly.
Yes.
So given that, how is military infrastructure relevant in the management of civilian crises of such magnitude?
Yeah, that war rhetoric, it's often used because it's very emotive. It reaches down to primal emotions. It gets people listening, and indeed it is a good way of getting your point across quickly and effectively. Now, in terms of what the military can offer at times like this, well, they can help in all sorts of ways. I can just cite you the example of the UK. We mobilised 25,000 service personnel to deal with the crisis. Eventually, we've used about 6,000 of them. And they've played a central part in many things. For instance, in the mass testing programme. The mass testing programme might not have been possible without them, in which case it would have been perhaps a lot more difficult to trace the progress of the virus through the community. They've also been absolutely indispensable in logistical support to the response. And of course, the one thing that the British forces have always been very, very good at is logistics. In other words, moving people around, moving material around, keeping those people supplied properly where you want them to be. For instance, the British Armed Forces were absolutely key in building the 7 Nightingale hospitals, which have produced a total of at least 12,000 other hospital beds. And these were built in a period of months rather than years. So the British forces have pretty much demonstrated that the answer to your question is yes. It's a big yes in capital letters, because the armed forces of any country are often the only ones with the skills and the training and the management to be able to steer big, sometimes huge logistical projects like this. And if you want to talk about what they might hypothetically do in future, possibly not during the current crisis, one thing that many of us have noticed is that governments, particularly local government in the UK and probably in other countries across Europe as well, local government is often not very good at prediction and planning. So perhaps the attachment of military officers, staff-trained military officers, to local councils to just assist them in this, to get them thinking about the processes of doing this efficiently and against time constraints as well, could be a useful future role for the armed forces in times like this.
Mm-hmm. So you think that after the success, ironically, during this crisis, that the local government will somehow use the armed forces in the future? Is it likely?
Sorry?
Is it likely?
No. An honest answer to that is I don't know. I'm just saying perhaps what they should consider doing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you know, armed forces are good at planning, projection, doing appreciations of what needs to be done. They're good at strategy. In other words, coming up with an end state that you want to reach and then a path to reaching that end state. And it has to be said, these are all things that local government is sometimes not very good at. This would have to be arranged at a central government level, obviously, because the armed forces in any country answer to the central government. So perhaps the central government could arrange for officers of appropriate rank and experience to be attached to local councils at certain levels, perhaps.
So finally, my final question has to do with the armed forces and Brexit. So the armed forces have stayed out of the Brexit debate, with the exception, of course, of the Galileo program and the sharing of capability via the EU satellite system. Do you project any wider disruption on collective security cooperation in the European continent, either be it NATO or in any bilateral cooperation frameworks?
Yeah. Well, obviously they had to stay out of the debate because our armed forces are completely professional and they're supposed to be utterly apolitical in a party political sense. But in terms of the defence of Europe, and I stress when I talk about Europe, I'm not talking about the same entity as the EU. I'm talking about the continent of Europe and the countries that are in it. Yes, there are going to be debates. There are going to be issues. There might even be the occasional argument. There might even be the occasional row, particularly over things like burden sharing and priorities. But I predict that these things are going to go out of the window the first time there's a major crisis, especially a military crisis on Europe's borders, North Africa or Eastern Europe, for instance. And when that happens, everybody is going to suddenly pull together. All differences are going to be forgotten. We're all going to be friends again. And it's worth remembering that the UK is still actually a major player internationally. We got a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. We're a G7 member, we're a G8 member. We're a nuclear power. We got a number of senior command positions in NATO. We are still, whatever the toings and froings of Mr. Trump's views on the world, we are still a close American ally. We've got a number of senior command positions in NATO. We've got respected armed forces with some world-class capabilities. And we generally, when we do go into military operations, we don't come with any of the major national caveats that certain other countries have on the deployment of their forces in operational areas. So we've still got plenty to offer where it really matters, which is at places elsewhere than back corridors in Brussels or Strasbourg or London or Paris or anywhere like that. And it's also vital to remember that the UK has always really valued its NATO membership. And it now sees NATO as the main body through which it engages its own security and the security of its neighbours. So I think all the major disruptions are going to come from elsewhere, probably from the election of more populist governments in certain parts of Europe, or perhaps if Mr. Trump is elected later on this year. So yes, there are going to be differences of opinion. There are going to be arguments, but at the end of the day, differences of opinion is all they're going to be.
Professor Anglim, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Eleni. And when